Episode 19, Dr. Izzy Moore, PhD.
Welcome to the Oxidative Potential Podcast, where we discuss all things sports science and performance. I'm your host, Matthew DeRoche, and with me is my fellow co-host, Phil Patterson. Enjoy. Good day, folks. On today's episode, we speak with Dr. Izzy Moore, PhD, and we discuss all things running biomechanics. We get into running shoes, we get into super shoes, we get into gait analysis, we get into cueing for gait, we get into specific strategies that different runners use. Also, we get into economy, efficiency, these things. Izzy is, she's a heavy hitter in the realm of biomechanics, and I've read tons of her research and always come away being like, that was a very solid paper. Like I took a ton from that. Always really good questions in her investigations. I've used some of her open source software that she's put out there, which is pretty cool. You can find that on the internet. I'll try and put a link to it in the show notes. So this was a great conversation. I really appreciate Dr. Moore taking the time to speak. She's got a lot of stuff going on, it was really nice for her to take the time, and I learned quite a bit. She's very, very well read in the realm. I mean, obviously, but she came out of the University of Exeter. That's where she worked through her PhD, and you can tell she's very intertwined with the literature, just pulling stuff off the top of her head. I could tell very, very sharp and up to date on what is out there. So if you guys want to find her, I'll leave the links to her Twitter, where you can find some of the stuff that she puts out there through Twitter. And also I'll leave a link to her ResearchGate profile and those things, so you can pick up on her research out there. I hope you guys enjoy this episode and take as much of it away as I did, and we'll catch you later, folks. To record. Okay, so Dr. Moore, I'm very happy to have you on the show today. It's kind of cool because you are the first person I've really kind of solidified in the research. Then your name just kept popping up when I first started reading research on economy. I just kept seeing your name pop up in all these papers and being referenced in other papers. And then I kind of ran into some of the software that you were doing work around and you'd put out there for essentially finding optimal cadence. And then it just kind of snowballed, and I really have gotten into trying to wrap my head around a lot of the misconceptions or things that I've been brought up to believe or read in some of the literature about economy, and trying to wrap my head around it, which we were just discussing before, is kind of difficult at times. But I think you provide a fairly good voice of reason out there. I've heard you speak on another podcast, which was Michael Erickson's, and I really enjoyed kind of the conservative tone, because I think there's a lot going out there now with everyone doing gait analysis. And so let's just start off, where's your career kind of gone since you've started? Did you always start off in running economy? Did you always start off in the space in exercise phys? Or?
Yeah, so I did, I guess, a really traditional route over here in the UK. I did an undergraduate in sports science, so I covered psychology as well as biomechanics and physiology. And then my PhD focused on economical running, so a blend of the biomechanics and physiology. I then took a bit of a different step, really, and went more the sports medicine route. So my postdoc was around sports injury epidemiology. And then once I got my lecturing post, so I did that postdoctoral position for 2 years, once I got my lecturing post, then I could explore anything and everything I wanted to. So I kept up that injury epidemiology, but also started going back to the economical running and have developed a bit more of an interest, as well as seeing it from a performance perspective. But if we are going to be changing gait, there potentially is a knock-on effect to the loads that we're being exerting, and therefore maybe our injury risk. So I'm actually combining, if you will, a bit of a performance and injury perspective, which is a bit of a nuance area, because you tend to find researchers sit in one camp or the other. But I've been quite interested in actually, if we are going to change gait, there are potential knock-on effects, both in terms of the economy and injury risk. And actually, we need to understand all of that, because when I speak with coaches, you guys have to think of those things as well. You can't just think about performance. So it makes sense that the research also tries to do that as well.
Yeah, that's actually like a great starting point, kind of like, because whenever we'll kind of move into shoes here, but whenever I hear athletes or coaches talking about changes in gait, running is a very unique sport wherein, you know, you may be exposing yourself to 10,000, 20,000 steps in a training session. And when you go ahead and change your gait, which people, a lot of the times they will spend a whole session focusing on specific gait cues, you've now loaded tissues in a different way, and loaded tissues, maybe new tissues in certain ways, 20,000 times over or 10,000 times over. Which is unlike pretty much any other sport where, you know, you go through these varied movements. They're not as cyclical. So talking about shoes, this is something I hear come up all the time. You know, people talking about changing into new shoes, running in these super shoes, minimalist, maximalist shoes. Let's just talk about maybe some of the things that can take into consideration when we're switching shoes, right? Should we switch shoes slowly, fastly? Should we have a lot of shoes in our quiver? What is the benefit of having maybe more shoes or less shoes, getting used to one, getting used to five? What's your thoughts around shoes? Where does your opinion lie around?
It's a fairly big topic for us to, I guess, begin with. Thank you for that. Shoes, in terms of transitioning, you do need to take a bit of time to do that. Obviously, when we look at the literature, a lot of the transitions tend to be actually quite short. So there'll be a few weeks. We did one several years ago now that was maybe 5-7 weeks, and actually that's quite a short window of time. And I think something to remember, though, if you are going to transition, it's about actually not doing the amount of running that you were doing before necessarily, and then now just swapping in those shoes and doing the same amount. Because like you said, we're going to be loading things differently. It might be that for one of the shorter runs, okay, that's when I might start bringing in a different pair of shoes and helping with that transition. So you need to have, again, that kind of graded exposure to get your body accustomed to those different loads. So you would want to do it over a period of time. I'm not going to put my hat on saying this many weeks, that many weeks. It will vary based on, you know, how much running you do as well. But you know, a good, like I said, ours was almost a couple of months in the end. So it's that kind of time frame of getting used to the shoe, and whether you vary some of the terrain in that as well, or where you're keeping the terrain consistent. So there's multiple factors that might play into that transition. But you do go back to almost graded exposure like you would from an injury. You're building up, if you will, that tolerance. And in terms of kind of rotating shoes or different shoes, there is a piece of research out there that actually shows that people that rotated at least having 2 different pairs of shoes had a lower injury risk than those that just had the one pair of shoes. So there does seem to be some support out there in terms of actually, if you are going to put loads on your body, having a bit of a variety. And one of the ways to increase that variety is potentially through your different shoes, because you might have different small changes to how you run that mean you induce a variability into your system that might lower your injury risk. Unfortunately, variability is a very hard thing to study, so we don't have a lot of firm evidence out there to say this kind of hypothesis on increasing variability is potentially good for the body. But one of the ways you can increase variability is through different shoes, because you might be making small adjustments to your gait in a way like you would if you ran on concrete compared to grass, for example.
Yeah. And I know running coaches have always supported that kind of concept through practice for many years, whether it's sprinting on different surfaces for sprinters, right? On tempo days, maybe they're doing a lot of grass sprinting. And same with uphill running, and, taking some load off of more concentric, less eccentric, right? And trail running for some groups as well. But I'd be interested to hear your take on these super shoes, because a lot of people are biting the bullet down to try and find that extra 5% or 4%. Obviously it's varied. The more competent you are as a runner, the less you're going to gain from these advanced technology shoes, like with the plates. But what are some of the considerations that people should take when they're engaging with these shoes? Let's say, for example, should they be training in them? Do you think it's smart to be training their weekly mileage in them? As expensive as they are aside, do you think that's appropriate? Do you think maybe just more on the familiarization side and then racing? What's your thoughts around super shoes?
That's it's certainly a topic that's got a lot of interest recently, and the debate back and forth. And I do think with these super shoes, if you're a recreational type runner and you're actually not that consistent in your, let's say, performance times, there's really probably little point getting shoes that may on one day increase your economy by 4%, improve your time, because actually you're just having a good or a bad day, stress wise or whatever may change that maybe to a greater degree. So these shoes really do actually are more at the top end, where people are actually very consistent with their performances and their times. That's where you might actually see more of a change, just because it's more noticeable rather than them just having a bad day. In terms of wearing them for training and so on, I know I have a pair because we were about to do a study before the lockdowns happened, and so we had some in the lab. I ended up having to buy one size for our lab, and I just took them home, and so I did run in them, and I know they are not built for a lot of mileage, let's say, but I think putting on a new pair of shoes to then run a race in is definitely, even just from a comfort perspective, not ideal. So I think being able to, like you say, build a familiarization to ingraining a bit more of a familiar pattern in terms of your running gait is probably important for you to actually also understand whether those shoes are comfortable, because actually there is a lot more research coming out there now about the importance of comfort from potentially an injury perspective and an economical perspective. And the kind of old way of going out and buying shoes, about pronation and those sorts of things, which we now, well, I don't think we have moved away from, but certainly the science has moved away from. Whenever friends come up to me and go, "What running shoes should I have?" and I'm like, whichever one is most comfortable for you, because actually that seems to be some evidence is actually supportive of that. And why buy shoes that aren't comfortable either? For the gimmicks or what have you, you need to be able to go and run consistently in them. So I do think it's important to make sure you are familiar with the shoe before pounding out a race in them.
Yeah, it's actually one of my biggest pet peeves. And that's why anytime I ask someone close to me to go out and buy running shoes or whatever, they're getting into running, I always go with them, because there is this, unfortunately, the people generally that work at shoe shops are very well intentioned, right? They've been taught by the people they've been trained by that, stability shoes and posts and all these things. And oh yeah, the foot, this person's a flat foot and they need this type of shoe. And I've seen many people try to be pushed into certain shoes based off really, you know, a lack of understanding of what's out there. And it's just hard, right? It's not like these people are scouring the research day after day of what shoes are appropriate. But I'm not well liked in some of those situations, trying to say, I don't think that, and realistically, you're right. From my experience and what I've seen people running in, the shoes that are generally the most comfortable, um, you know, not only that, just injury wise, but also just provide the best experience for people a lot of the times, which is a huge factor. Like if you're going out in shoes, I've gone out in shoes. I think a lot of people have gone out in shoes, and running is a different thing when you're in a pair of shoes that aren't, that well made for your feet, whether that's, constricted toe boxes, or, heel cup doesn't fit properly, or maybe there's a post. So yeah, that is, I think maybe like just speak on that for a couple seconds, because there's this whole concept of, this post is going to prevent you from ankle eversion, right? And it's going to prevent you from pronating. And this is, what we want as a runner. Maybe just spit off on that for a few minutes.
Yeah, that was, and it was really, there was a seminal paper by Professor Benno Nigg back in the 80s, I think. Very, again, well-intentioned scientist, very excellent, prominent scientist in the footwear biomechanics field, put out this notion around footwear and pronation, and pronation might be bad. I'm very much kind of simplifying it, but pronation might be bad. And so if we control the amount of pronation, that is potentially a good thing for your injury risk. He's subsequently come out, even just a few years ago now, and has come along with a couple of different theories, because that theory around pronation, there's just the evidence isn't there to support it from a link pronation to injury, but also the shoes that we put people in, sometimes it does control it, sometimes it doesn't. Again, it's just a very varied response. But like you say, it's something that if you go to these shoe shops, that's probably part and parcel of some of their training to some extent. And it still does get marketed quite a lot by the shoe companies as well. So who can kind of blame the poor shopper sales assistants? And it's an easy one for, I think, people to also understand. Okay, I've maybe got a bit too much motion, I put a shoe on and that kind of controls it. And I guess it's kind of seeing motion as a bad thing, rather than actually that's what my joint might be made to do. And it can do it quite well and doesn't need to be restricted. And this is, I guess, where things like, the barefoot running kind of, maybe fad is too strong, but certainly that movement around barefoot running, and that's where it's more about the body doing what it's meant to do and being more natural with what it's doing. And whereas a shoe then comes along and restricts it, if a kind of the kind of polar opposite sides of that argument, really. Whereas I think now, like I said, Benno Nigg's come along, and one of the kind of theories that people are starting to explore is actually a shoe that helps your body and your foot move in your preferred movement path. So actually something that supports your body doing what it's meant to be doing, rather than restricting it.
No, that was great. I think the motion control thing is always kind of funny concept to me, because realistically, if this person's foot is flat, they are now in a limited range of motion, essentially, right? They have less excursion of the joint range of motion than if they had a neutral position. So that concept doesn't even make sense to me a lot of the times. But there is a lot of funny stuff in the marketing. But that brought up another, let's kind of hit on minimalist shoes now, because I'm a fan of minimalist shoes when appropriate, and that is very few places. But maybe I need to be, enlightened a little bit more on that. But my understanding is that they provide, good benefits to cross-sectional density of the intrinsic foot muscles, right? Just with regular everyday activities in minimalist shoes. Also, they do tend to change gait patterns, and from what I understand, it's parsed out kind of. It's hard to understand whether that's through the weight or just the different types of loading that goes on. Like the peak loading changes the in different portions of the foot strike or the foot motion, and the Achilles loading. All these things kind of change the position of the foot when it's coming into contact with the ground. Help us understand what is the benefit to wearing a minimalist shoe, if any. What do you think is appropriate for barefoot? If someone was really set on going minimalist, what would you kind of give that person? And for the person on the other side, maximalist, oh, never, you're going to break you're going to break your metatarsals. What's your, where do you stand on that? Where do you?
Like so, I've actually used minimalist footwear personally. Not talk about evidence here. When I was rehabbing my knee, I've had ACL surgeries both for my left and right knee, and occasionally one of them has flared up. And I was at the time doing my PhD where I did look at barefoot minimalist shoes, and I did go, well, maybe there is something to actually going, what does my body want to do? Because as soon as you put a shoe on, you are taking away what we call that somatosensory feedback, which, that direct contact we have with the ground. It's a little bit like boxing and putting gloves on allows us to hit people harder because we're reducing that sensation of pain from doing it. So we take our shoes off, we now have to adapt just naturally in our body. Now, some people will do that more so and change their gait to a greater degree than maybe others. And I do think something to say about kind of barefoot, and therefore, because I guess the really true minimalist footwear almost kind of got born out of, you can do your barefoot running, but with the safety of a shoe, is barefoot running is often actually a barefoot running form that not everyone does when they go barefoot. And by that, it is like you say, so you normally hit with your forefoot, so it's what we call a more anterior foot strike. You have more choppy strides, so a quicker cadence, shorter stride length, tend to spend less time with your foot in contact with the ground, and the leg is more flexed as you hit the ground as well. That's kind of really a barefoot running form, but not everyone does it if they simply take their shoes off. And the minimalist shoes, the really kind of very minimal, and I mean the ones that have very little of a kind of shoe construction around them, the kind of a piece of rubber or really thin sole under the foot, are trying to help you produce that barefoot running form, because they haven't got all of these other bits and pieces that might control what your foot is doing, and a very small amount of material between your foot and the ground. And in the world we live in, it's probably recommended that you have some sort of protection on your feet rather than going out but running barefoot, right? So I think that's an important point to make about where minimalist footwear came from. It doesn't necessarily mean that you will change your gait to this barefoot running form. So some people might just be able to run in minimalist footwear and actually not make as many changes. And with that, you might then see an increase in injury risk because they might be having greater loading and the rate of loading because they haven't really adapted their gait. And that's kind of, there is a study that shows that minimalist footwear seems to have a greater injury risk than neutral footwear. But like you've said, there's potential performance benefit because now the shoes weigh less. And we know that's important for economy. So if you have shoes that are really lightweight, so around 220 grams per shoe or less, we know that from an economical perspective, that's beneficial. It's like almost running barefoot. But then when you get heavier, your oxygen consumption goes up, and you can see it as basically a 1% increase in oxygen consumption for every extra 100 grams you're carrying. And the reason for that is you are simply carrying more mass on your foot and having to move your leg. And so there's a greater kind of resistance to that movement. So it makes sense that your muscles are now going to have to work harder and to lift your feet. So there is this, I guess, a bit of a fine line depending on who the runner is. You know, again, it comes back to, are you going to notice that performance benefit because you're running that consistently, that a few percent is something that you really want to harness? But are you equally adapting your gait to maybe switch it up a little bit to help reduce that loading? Because we know that if you don't switch it up, the loading is actually higher. And in terms of maximalist footwear, again, so we've kind of gone, you know, full kind of spectrum. Minimalist footwear came in, and then that's now been trying to pushed out the window, and maximalist has come in, and you can see these massive, really massive shoes. And actually, a lot of them don't offer that much of an advantage in terms of maybe reducing the forces. You don't need them that big to reduce the forces. Actually, there's a really nice study that just kind of manipulated, you know, by a few mil each time, from about 1 millimeter of cushioning up to about 29 millimeters. And after about 5 millimeters of cushioning, the loading is the same. So actually going full hog and going to a really extreme level doesn't seem to be, you know, in terms of maybe an injury perspective, that beneficial really.
Yeah, that kind of brings up, you know, some of the things I think about when I'm, you know, seeing who's asking about the minimal footwear. The first thing I kind of take into consideration, tell me if I'm off here, but it's, I think of the athlete's ability to, you know, enhance coordination. Like how well is their motor learning patterns? Like how well can they pick up a new activity and adapt it? Because essentially when you're talking about, you know, whether it's reducing the sole thickness, you know, providing more stimulation to the mechanoreceptors of vibration and trying to, you know, kind of reduce this kinematic jerk. So you're trying to, you know, give the body more sensory information so it can provide better feed forward mechanisms to protect itself essentially and prepare for the jerk, because jerk is erratic and it causes stress, right, at the tissues. But if that athlete doesn't really have a good ability to coordinate well with change, right, how well their physical literacy is and their physical IQ, that may hinder the athlete trying to switch over to some of these, you know, more minimalist shoes, right? Because a lot of the times their motor patterning takes too long to, or like you said, doesn't really change at all. And now they're just providing less protection to the foot. But yeah, I think, you know, the way you described it there was with talking about the different, that research you were talking about with the different, from 1 to 29. That was interesting because I don't think I've come across that piece before. But I'd be interested to see it because it kind of does make a lot of sense to a lot of the stuff that I've thought about with you know, these different sole thicknesses. So do you think for runners it's probably good to have kind of a varied quiver of maybe a more maximal shoes for, you know, the longer runs, and then provide some more of that sensory input for maybe some of the higher paced running where they're going to be putting a lot of stress on the tissues already to give them more sensory information? What's your thoughts? Where do you go with that for if someone's asking you, what should my quiver look like?
And then the answer is always it's probably dependent on you. And I think there might be something to not just always having the minimalist footwear for the longer runs, because then you are also becoming more accustomed to the different loading patterns more kind of over a consistent period. And you might end up, if you're using only minimalist shoes for the shorter, faster runs, you're actually getting only used to them at those speeds. So there is also this need to actually kind of go, well, you run a certain way at one speed, it doesn't necessarily mean you do it in a slower speed, because we know as your speed increases, there's certain differences that change in terms of cadence, ranges of motion, maybe how far in front of you your leg is reaching out, and so on. So yeah, you want to be mindful that you're not just basically almost conditioning your body to one speed with one footwear, and the slower speed with a different type of footwear. And then which one would you choose for a race? The minimalist shoes, because they're less. So yeah, it's a tricky one. It's almost actually, if you can maybe build up to a point where actually you could go for either a long or a short, faster run in either shoe, and you're then kind of body is okay with whether you need to run faster towards the end of the race. It doesn't matter what shoes you have, because you're used to it. But likewise, when you're going slower, you can also tolerate the maybe higher loads for minimalist footwear, or less load in the cushion footwear. So it's probably actually not as simple as just saying long go with that one and short go with minimalist. But again, it does depend on how maximal and how minimalist we are talking as well. I'm assuming that we're talking the real extremes of the spectrum here. But actually, a lot of the minimalist footwear these days isn't as minimalist as it first initially started out being, I guess. And that's something to bear in mind.
No, that's good. I really like that, because that does bring up some good points of trying to, linear progression, right? Trying to progress up with load if you can tolerate more, and you're still getting gains, and things are moving well, right? And things are you're not having any hiccups along the way for the most part. Why not continue to try and gain some more distance in some of these minimalist shoes, and also try and challenge with some of these thicker shoes for shorter, right? Challenge the body in a different way, and changing the stimulus a little bit. I think, I'm a huge fan of those people that, are constantly varying the stimulus to some degree, like trying to get exposed to a lot of the stimulus, because I do think that is a fairly good way to, prevent injury, especially in sports where it's extremely cyclical, and you're seeing, the patterns. I always steal this from John, is motor unit enslavement, right? It's building this deep rut in the brain, and anytime you vary outside of that, there's a timing miss and an injury or whatever. But yeah, that was really good. That was it's a good stream. Let's talk about biomechanical strategies. There's so much misconception I see around some of this stuff, as 4 foot has to be 4 foot, and oh no, it's where it lands under the relative to the hip, and it has to be triple extension. If you're not extending, you're losing power, you don't have power. I see, and it's always the loudest folks out there too that are saying this, unfortunately. I don't hear much talk about shank angle. I don't hear much talk about, difference in anthropometrics. I don't hear much talk about, the stage the runner's at. And some of the things I see, because I've seen it, is people changing biomechanics without supporting structures underlying them. A lot of the times when we see someone, like, I think everyone's probably seen a bodybuilder run, right, with the arms out to stabilize. Well, if you try and, I think I always see this as people trying to coach biomechanics when the structures aren't there to rely upon. So you're forcing someone into a box where they're compensating for something that they don't have, and you're trying to make them have something that they don't have. It doesn't anyways, it doesn't make sense to me. It really bothers me when I see people just say, change this, change that. Well, there's a way that they're self-organizing that way. Yeah, it might be because they're green, but it's probably because the tissues aren't ready to handle the loads in those ways, maybe, or there's a lot of other factors, right? But talk about some of the things that you see in elite runners, maybe, versus, you know, more amateur runners. What are the common things that you see? And then we'll kind of move into what are the misconceptions that you hear out there kind of mixed in with that? You know, what is yeah.
It's from this is a very kind of general perspective, because there's no real, you know, one way to run, as I'm sure you know. But in terms of the research, it does seem to show that the higher end of the spectrum in terms of running, the elite, well trained, they tend to spend more time in the air in their kind of gait cycle. So they have shorter ground contact time, and during that ground their contact time, it tends to be similar between kind of the varying spectrum of runners, but they spend more time in the air, the elite runners, so they're kind of almost getting more bang for the buck. So they can produce higher forces in the same amount of time, and then means they get in the air, and they can obviously then have more forward movement by spending more time in the air. And they tend to have stiffer, so greater leg stiffness. And what that potentially helps do is kind of have more of a consistent center of mass movement. So rather than a kind of real bobbing up and down center of mass, by having a stiffer leg, that center of mass can actually not stay obviously completely horizontal. It will go up and down because running is a bouncing gait, but it doesn't necessarily do it to the same degree as some of the less well-trained runners who might actually have a less stiffness in their system. And so having that stiffer limb, the more aerial time, the greater forces, they can then lengthen their stride at the same speed as less well-trained runners. So there are kind of these kind of kinetic type strategies that trained runners show. And when we look at untrained runners, they actually are, unsurprisingly, less of a homogeneous group. We did a study actually where we had some trained and untrained runners, and again, this notion of stiffness, we had a nice relationship in higher stiffness, greater forces in our trained runners. So that shows that that's how they're stiffening the system. Whereas in untrained runners, that relationship wasn't there to the same degree, which basically means they're kind of creating that stiffness through different strategies, which are a little bit less consistent across the group. And you kind of expect that, I guess. They've had less exposure to running, less coaching, which might put them in more of a similar running form as, you know, the next person in that group. These are just people going out and running, and you would expect greater variation. That's what we do tend to see. So it's hard to kind of paint a real kind of general picture, but in essence, kind of a stiffer gait with the elites and being able to get more time in the air, even though they're on the ground for the same amount of time.
I have kind of hypothesis that, you know, a lot of people, the amount of time it takes, obviously tendons, ligaments tendons mainly, obviously, to adapt to running. I feel like maybe, because it's funny when I ask someone that is, you know, rather new to running to explain to me, what is the leg doing? What are you doing with your muscles with running? They think it's this push off thing, where a lot of times with elite runners, it's more of an isometric contraction, and you're seeing a lot of loading of the tendon, right? And part of it makes me wonder how much of that is the brain involved in saying, you know, these tissues aren't ready to handle the capacity of isometric contraction as much, so we're going to use a more muscular strategy. And it kind of makes sense of some of the stuff I see with other sports that are very heavy tendon reliant, like climbing and different things like that. You know, and in gymnastics and the development, the strategies that people use. But It is something that I note that, these more elite runners, they have a higher stiffness, and then people will see that this kind of gazelle-like creature hopping along and try to copy that. And it, may not be the most appropriate thing to just try and copy gait, because maybe you can elaborate on this. Because I know there's a lot of research on cueing, not a lot, I shouldn't say a lot, but there's research on cueing and how that affects gait. There's so many, this is 10 podcasts right here is cueing. But maybe just talk about why cueing may not be appropriate for, beginner run, certain cueing, right? Maybe do things need time? I don't know.
I like to say cueing is one of the main things that you do potentially in coaching, and it makes sense that the research has started to look at it. Maybe look at how we cue in particular.
Yeah.
And I won't go to the dark depths of the theory behind it, but in essence, mainly cues fit into either I'm telling you to move a specific body part, and that we call internal cueing. And do this with your foot, do this with your arm, or it's we say it's kind of related to the environment, and it's what's known as an external cue. And the one that's often used in running is something like run quietly. Or we're using analogies which aren't the same as external. So it might be kind of like say about that kind of gazelle, like run like a gazelle. So it's this kind of like something. The issue with that kind of analogy approach and the external cueing is they're really ambiguous, right? Like your impression of a gazelle, my impression, or your impression of what quietly means, and mine. I mean, what does that mean? And this is something we've seen in the lab. So we've done one paper that's published and another one that's currently under review, and we basically see quite a varied response when you give these kind of ambiguous cues. And I find it quite interesting, because when I speak with, for example, strength conditioning coaches, they're all over the kind of external cueing, because the research typically says, that will improve your performance. So it'll help you, throw with better accuracy, throw better, kick the ball faster. But when we're actually but in running, the goal ultimately maybe is to improve our race time, but actually it is about the running gait itself. Why would you give someone an ambiguous cue to do that? So it makes more intuitive sense, and certainly what our research shows, that if you want to change a specific thing about how someone is running, you need to give them that cue about their body, that internal focus cue. And but don't give too many cues, because it's kind of that overloading the system, right? But we also know that even with the greatest will in the world, there are some people you cue them and they will do weird and wonderful things. And that is, maybe they don't understand the cue, maybe it's their interpretation of the cue, maybe it's because they literally have no idea what they're doing. A lot of people that we have brought into the lab, and we've tended to focus just on Footstrike, because it's actually just, you can alter Footstrike by one joint movement. So it kind of almost, it's a really controlled way of trying to examine cueing. But most people have no idea how they hit the ground with their foot, whether they're a rear foot striker or forefoot striker. And actually, most people like to think they're a midfoot or forefoot striker for some reason. That seems to be the and actually there are very few people who do midfoot strike. It's a very unique pattern in comparison to kind of forefoot and midfoot. But anyway, so a lot of people aren't actually aware of how they run, and you're now consciously making them think about it. And running often has been a very subconscious process. So that's something to kind of, if you're going down the route of cueing people, you don't want to overload them. You actually also need to get their interpretation, like, well, this is what I'm trying to do when you cue me, and actually you might need, that's not what I'm expecting. But from our research, it certainly shows that you just be specific. Don't spend time coming up with these weird and wonderful analogies and other things. to try and get them to do something, because that analogy may work for one person, but doesn't mean you're going to get that consistently across the group. And again, our data shows that you do get a lot more variability in responses when you use this external focus.
Yeah, I think that was perfectly said. Like, because from the sprinting world, we know, sprinters can be ruined easily, especially by, for example, a sprinter with a more muscular strategy, right? Whereas a sprinter versus a sprinter with a more tendinous strategy, it's more plyometric, right? Using the tendons, elastic, sorry, Jesus. Trying to coach a athlete that spent 15 years using a specific strategy, and telling them to run, use more of their tendinous tissue and run like that, you can completely destroy a runner. And I just see inappropriate cueing. And sometimes, people want to cue because they feel that's the only way they'll be useful in coaching. You know what I mean? They feel like they have to cue, but a lot of the times I think it's a very fine line. And I think the way you spoke about that was perfect, because it's like, if you are going to be cueing, be specific. Is there something specific you're trying to see, and see how it works out for the athlete, right? Also be reflective. Is this something they're going to have to work into? Is this something that's just a no-go? It's just a mess right from the start. Yeah. Oh, is it starting to click already? Yeah, these things, unfortunately, are lost a lot of the times. And it's just like, 180 Footstrike, 4-foot. And you're right. Runners generally do not know where they're striking the ground with what part of their foot. And I don't know how many people I've argued with, I'm a 4-foot striker, because, whatever's out there in the media. And like, I'm literally putting a GoPro, connecting it to a screen in front of them. I'll say, okay, start running. We'll see how much 4-foot you're hitting with. Yeah, it's just, people have these camps that they want to be in. And I think, you did a good job kind of explaining, like, just because you're 4-foot or rear foot is not really going to make you a better or worse runner. It's agnostic where you hit your foot. It's about how economical you can be in those positions, and where you're loading them. Yeah.
And to be honest, that's the research in terms of foot strike and economy. Basically, keep doing what you're doing. It's what you see from the research. If you're a rear foot striker, you're more likely to be more economical rear foot striking than if we switch you up to a 4-foot, and vice versa, generally speaking. And that's not really too surprising. Like I say, it's one joint, one part of the running gait. And although you can probably change it quite quickly, often when you actually see people 4-foot strike, there is this almost mix up in the literature. So there is what sprinters do, which we would normally term kind of a toe strike, or a lot of sprinters do. So toe hits ground and the heel doesn't actually hit the ground. So it comes close to it, and then they have such stiff ankles that they're able then to reverse that without going down to the ground. Whereas in endurance running, no one runs with a toe strike. They run where your toes do hit the ground, but then as your tibia rotates forward, your heel then touches the ground. And actually, when you do get some people in the lab and go 4-foot strike, they'll literally run like they're running on their tiptoes.
Yes.
And you're like,
yes.
No one runs. Well, no one runs at that speed. Is the way of saying it. So yeah, it takes a bit of kind of coaching and cueing to actually go, no, I literally mean just kind of, it's orientating that foot. It often helps if you bring the foot closer to the body to help with then that heel kind of hitting the ground. But yeah, it's quite an interesting one to see, because people straight away go, oh, you mean just literally run on my toes? And you're like, no, I don't mean that at all.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm laughing so much because that's my partner. Like when she went to this 4-foot strike thing, I watched her like, cause she's like going into this 4-foot striking phase, you know, and changing stuff in her gait. And, you know, she was informing me. And then I went out and watched her like 4 months later. And I was like, you've been running like this the whole time. You've literally been running on your tiptoes. Like it looked like a cartoon where you're watching like someone sneak. And I was like, I can't believe your tissues held up to that. Like it was amazing to see how adaptable the human is and how resilient it can be, because the amount of load you're putting through some of those tissues when you're running like that is excessive. But yeah, that it's funny.
Particularly, yeah, the calf in that instant. The calf is
Yes,
doing a hell of a lot of work.
yeah, the soleus. Yeah, the let's talk about you know, sex differences, because there's some considerations to take, I think, you know, and the research obviously isn't parsed all this stuff out, but what are some things to considerate when, you know, maybe, for example, for females, right, they have breast tissue they have to be cognizant of, right, and they have, you know, their hips are generally shaped different than a male's also, um, and they also generally kind of use a different strategy for movement. A lot of times it can be more economical, we see. um, I see that with all sports. Women generally take a, you know, much different approach than men with everything they do, more economical for the most part, obviously because of the inherent qualities, I think. But maybe what should they take into consideration, like, you know, especially with their arms, with the rotation and, you know, the disassociation between the thorax and the pelvis, some of these things, because they're managing a different body than a male. And if they're going to go out and try and mimic someone else, maybe there might be some things to take in consideration. Yeah.
Exactly, and you've actually uh, been more ahead of the research with your thinking, because a lot of how people have looked at female runners is what I kind of term a male perspective. And by that is, when we maybe look at a female runner and we compare them to a male runner, we have to go down to the simplest kind of form or the common denominator, which is ignore the breast biomechanics, because well, I've got nothing to compare it to. And so actually we know very little about the female runner comparatively, which is shocking, you know, given it's, you know, half the population. But they've always been kind of maybe a comparative study or an afterthought, and typically it's been a very kind of male dominated arena in terms of what we know. But that's true of pretty much all sports science knowledge. But you're right, so particularly for women, breast biomechanics, they play a key role. We don't know as much as we should, but what we do know is we see that they move in this 3-dimensional figure of 8, and that can induce, you know, greater forces that you exert at the ground, differences in the amount of knee flexion, differences in stride length, and you want to essentially make sure that they've got the most appropriate breast support. And that might be one that helps to minimize that amount of motion. And that might also help minimize the amount of pain, because actually a lot of women run with breast pain as if it's a normal thing to happen, which, you know, really that shouldn't be seen as normal. It should be something we look to do. But by having that extra motion, we think, but we don't know because no one's looked at this, that obviously that then brings into differences in terms of the rotation, and as you say, that couplet. So there's a coupling between the upper body and lower body. And if you just go and watch a runner in the park and with this mindset, you'll see that if their legs seem to be kind of having a lot of abduction and rotation and going on, and maybe quite a, like what people term kind of collapsing happening. And then you look at what their arms are doing, and you'll see their arms coming often quite across their body and be kind of like having a lot of rotation around that kind of spinal column, really. And that's because essentially the upper body and lower body need to counteract each other. So if you have the added breast biomechanics in that, and you don't minimize the motion, now all of a sudden you've got extra kind of rotation going on that your arms have to take into account. Your legs might have to compensate as well to ensure that you're essentially not, a kind of extreme version, but you're not running around in a circle because you're being able to counteract that momentum. It's actually something that I'm we're really looking forward to kind of researching with a colleague out in Canberra University, Dr. Celeste Coltman, is this notion of, well, what does breast motion, how does it affect our economy, and how does it link with that coupling going on? So we do have a study that we're hoping to look into this, because it's literally not been done in female runners. So apart from the lack of research in the breast, what we do see in the lower body is kind of greater rotation at the hip, at the knee, greater adduction as well than males. And this may simply be a factor because of the breast biomechanics, but we don't know, because in all of this research, they tend to just look from the hip down and ignore the 50% of the body mass in the upper body. So unfortunately, we don't know as much about female runners as we should do, but I'm happy to say that I think we are now aware of that, and there is a lot more being done in that space, and a lot more people, recognizing that breast biomechanics play a role, which, I mean, it sounds obvious, doesn't it? But that's the state of the field has been very much driven from males driving the research agenda, and they have a male perspective, and they look at male runners, and then they teach the next generation of researchers who get taught that male perspective and that male runners. So it's kind of snowball effect, if you will. And that's how we've ended up in this place that we know not as much as we should about female runners.
Yeah, there's just talking about the lack of upper body research, like I find it, because I'm really kind of into the whole respiratory training when appropriate, right? And just thinking of some of the things I see, commonalities I see between runners with low FEV1, so essentially, or some type of respiratory coordination issue or capacity issue. A lot of that I've found great correlation to the way that they disassociate the thorax from the pelvis. Whether it's too stiff or too much, like they lack spinal stability to a degree where, there's too much disassociation going on there. Or it's too stiff. Like, we talked about the bodybuilder, strength sport athletes, CrossFitters, like there's a very, very rigid spine there. And the ability to get a 360 breath, right, into the rib cage. I think there's a lot to just kind of pick out just with the biomechanics of the upper body. It's just crazy because there's so much. I don't know if I've seen one piece of research on the upper body other than arms, right? We've seen some on arms, but when we're talking about the spinal column and like breast tissue and all these different things, like there's so little consideration. What are some of the things that you're excited to see? Like, because I know you just touched on there, like, more representation of women in the research, more upper body. What are some of the other things that you're excited or close to, getting some good data on to kind of further support maybe more investigations? What are some of the things that you're excited about in the field right now?
As you say, so I've got that research going on with female runners, which I am actually really excited about, because it will be a really unique, needed data set that will give a really thorough analysis of the female runner from a female perspective, not just a comparison. And we currently, as mentioned before, we have a paper which looks at the efficiency of a runner actually with different cueing, and we've done it from a very kind of theoretical perspective of gait retraining that is often used in injury, but looking at this concept of whether it affects your efficiency. So that's some of the research I have one hopefully coming out soon, and research takes its time. So the female one probably take another year or two, because we've not yet finished data collection. And then I think aside from that, I actually think now a lot more of obviously the wearable technology, and there are some wearable technologies out there that have at least been validated, and as researchers we have a bit more confidence in. That opens up a bit of a door to more training studies, because we know that there are very few, because trying to get them in the lab and do very controlled training studies, there's pros and cons of those from the science perspective, but often cons from an applied perspective. And I think we've seen some nice uses of wearable technology. Dr. Rich Willey over in America has done some great cadence manipulation with a foot pod and a Garmin. And I think the more we can actually understand what people are doing when they're going out running, in the wild, so to speak, the better. Because at the moment, you come into a lab and you run over a 10-meter runway and force plate, but then you go outside and you've got all these different terrains and so on, uphill, downhill, corners, jumping often on pavements. So I think there aren't specific research questions I necessarily have, but it just opens up a different world that we haven't had before, that we can start to explore and understand runners in their world, as it were. We have the same with sports. We now can actually start looking more in the field with all of the kind of video and performance analysis type data we have, and the wearable technology potentially opens up that door with runners.
That's huge. It's funny, I sleep on the tech. One thing I have noticed is like the foot pods becoming more accessible. I'm a huge fan of foot pods. Pressure mapping, like that's something I use in my practice now, seeing actually some commercialization of insole pressure mapping, which I just think holds huge implications of understanding how people are interacting with their shoes and over time and throughout their run. I just see huge. The other ones too I've been reading is some of the musical interventions for different gait parameters. Some of those things sound super fascinating and seem to show some pretty cool findings so far, at least. Those are all. No, sometimes I forget that those things are kind of coming up, like they're coming out, they're coming up. Those will be really nice to see. I really appreciate the time. I know that you are, they say every day they print money, but they don't print time. And I really appreciate you taking your time today to come and speak on these topics, because I really do respect your take on things, and also really enjoyed your research over the years. I know people can find you on Twitter, right? Dr. Izzy Moore on Twitter.
Yes. Izzy Moore PhD on Twitter.
Okay. Folks, if you're a coach or a researcher, check out her research. And also she has a free, like you can find it online for Windows. It's an application to manipulate gait, and you can connect physiological metrics to that, SMO2 or heart rate. I love playing around with that. So if you guys want to check that out too. Anyways, I appreciate you coming on today, Izzy.
I really appreciate it. Thank you, Matthew. I mean, it's always nice to speak to people and know that the research is getting read, and it's been a really interesting discussion, and I really like learning about how people are applying the research and using it as well. So thank you for taking time to have this podcast as well.
Awesome. Enjoy, folks.